Peace appears to be returning to strife-torn Laos with the formation of a coalition government composed of right-wing, communist, and neutralist leaders. The United States has poured supplies into the country as Laos fought a debilitating war against communism. The groundwork for the agreement was set last June in Vienna when President Kennedy met with Chairman Khrushchev. At that time, they both pledged to work towards a solution. Now, in the Plan d'Asia in central Laos, that pledge takes fruit as Prince Bunum arrives at a conference of the three factions. Bunum is waiving any post in the new government, a step that the U.S. has insisted upon. Aid to Laos was cut off in February until he did resign. One of the triumvirate is Prince Suvarnabhumi, pro-communist head of the Pathet Lao movement. He will be joined in the new government by General Phumi Nosavan, right-wing military chief. The left-wing and right-wing leaders will rule with Prince Suvarnabhumi, a neutralist, and an 18-man cabinet composed of all three political shades. The agreement they reach in the dilapidated Army Officers Club will be ratified in Geneva, and within 75 days, all foreign troops are to be withdrawn. This is the international agreement drawn up by 13 nations last year to guarantee Laotian independence. Whether it will bring permanent peace, only time will tell.
Laos, America's not-so-secret war in Asia. Reported by Charles Collingwood. Who, what, when, where, why?
Piece by piece, the story of the American involvement in that war in Laos is coming out. Friday, the president reported 67,000 North Vietnamese troops now there. Yesterday, the White House said that it will issue a regular, up-to-date account of U.S. casualties in Laos. Today, American jets from Thailand and from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin continued to fly a heavy schedule of missions against the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao, whose vanguard has now pushed to within 14 miles of the royal capital of Luang Prabang. In the administrative capital, Vientiane, the Prime Minister, Suvarnabhumi, is waiting for the delivery of the peace demands of his half-brother and antagonist, the communist Prince Suvarnabhumi. After years of secrecy and silence, we are now learning a lot about Laos. Less than 6 months ago, when the president was first asked about Laos, he left more unsaid than he revealed.
There are no American combat forces in Laos. We have been providing logistical support and some training for the neutralist government in order to avoid Laos falling under communist domination. As far as American manpower in Laos is concerned, there are none there at the present time on a combat basis. We do have aerial reconnaissance. We do have perhaps some other activities. I won't discuss those other activities at this time.
That was in September. But last week, public pressure and what he called grossly inaccurate reports caused the president to discuss, after all, those matters in a lengthy statement. He still did not tell all. The president disclosed no precise figures on the dimensions of American air power being used in Laos, no accounting of the cost of our support, estimated at several $100 million a year, no definition of the degree of command as distinct from advisory functions exercised by Americans there. Inevitably, the presidential statement on Laos has raised many questions, as many as it answered. The questions clearly derive from continued congressional and public uneasiness over the war in Vietnam. Laos is a theater of that war. It could hardly be otherwise. For 1,000 miles, the borders of Laos march with those of North Vietnam. And for a further 300 miles, Laos borders on South Vietnam. That's the geographical explanation for the Ho Chi Minh Trail, along which President Nixon says the great bulk of the men and supplies of the war in South Vietnam are infiltrated. In addition, Laos shares 264 miles of border in the north with communist China, and another 1,000 miles to the west with threatened Thailand. To its south is Cambodia. The strategic implications are clear. Any change in the status of Laos must send tremors throughout the entire area. Moreover, Laos is terribly vulnerable. Here is a country larger than Great Britain, with a population of less than 3 million people. Whenever it suits them, the more numerous and warlike North Vietnamese can move into Laos, and it's been suiting them for the last 500 years, particularly during the recent years of the war in Vietnam. To control the border areas of Laos was absolutely essential to North Vietnam's strategy. Step back only 9 years in history, and you find it was Laos, even more than Vietnam itself, that was the most important foreign policy problem to a newly elected president.
The security of all Southeast Asia will be endangered if Laos loses its neutral independence. Its own safety runs with the safety of us all, in real neutrality observed by all. I want to make it clear to the American people and to all the world that all we want in Laos is peace, not war. A truly neutral government, not a Cold War pawn. A settlement concluded at the conference table and not on the battlefield.
Now, what President Kennedy did about Laos was to get an international agreement to cool things off. When he met Khrushchev in 1961, the one thing they agreed on was not to let Laos become an active theater of war. The result was the Geneva Accords of 1962, signed by 14 countries, including the United States, Russia, Communist China, and North Vietnam. These agreements provided for a neutral Laos governed by a coalition of 3 princes, representing the 3 main factions: Boon the conservative, Suvarnabhumi, the communist, and the neutralist Suvarnabhumi, who became premier. The agreements also called for the withdrawal of all foreign military personnel. The United States duly pulled out its 666 advisors, but the North Vietnamese only removed a token 40 of their 6,000 troops in Laos. Thereafter, Suvarnabhumi and the communists walked out of the coalition government, and with their Pathet Lao forces stiffened by increasing numbers of North Vietnamese regulars, they've been holding 2/3 of the country and 1/4 of the Laotian population ever since. The purely Laotian forces on either side are generally considered mediocre and unaggressive. The best on the government side are the clandestine army, commanded by General Phang Pao and fully paid, equipped, and advised by the United States. The Pathet Lao, although trained in North Vietnamese tactics and equipped with Russian and Chinese weapons, are not considered very formidable either. Left to themselves, the opposing Laotian forces would probably cancel each other out. The crucial factor in the equation is the 67,000 North Vietnamese regulars President Nixon says are in Laos now, in direct violation, the President says, of the 1962 Geneva Agreements. In spite of American equipment, advice, and above all, air power, the North Vietnamese hold the military initiative in Laos today. The United States is said to be flying an average of 500 air sorties a day, sometimes as many as 20,000 a month against targets in Laos. Most of these strikes come from U.S. bases across the Mekong River in Thailand. The White House said we made our first B-52 strike last month. But U.S. air power has still not been enough to do more than slow down the North Vietnamese forces. In the past couple of weeks, they have moved deeper into government territory than they ever have. Bernard Kalb reports on the resulting situation and what it means. At the time of the Geneva Agreements in 1962, the United States accepted Prince Suvarnabhumi as prime minister with some reluctance. He was a neutralist, but he seemed to be more neutral on the side of the communists. Indeed, he was their candidate. Since then, he has emerged as a pro-Western nationalist. If his position is now threatened by the growing North Vietnamese strength in Laos, Suvarnabhumi did not admit it to CBS News correspondent Bill McLaughlin.
Il faut tout de même pas trop
Despite everything,
donner d'importance
we should not give too much importance
à cette
to this
offensive.
offensive.
Évidemment,
Of course,
nous avons perdu
we have
des
lost
hommes.
men.
Évidemment, nous avons
Of course,
perdu
we've
des
lost some ground.
territoires. Mais
But so far,
jusqu'à présent,
it has not
ça ne dépasse pas
exceeded the range of normal
le
offensives.
degré des offensives normales. Je ne pense pas
I don't think
que cette façon
that the way
d'agir
North
du
Vietnam is
Vietnam
acting
donne l'indication
gives any indication
que le Nord-Vietnam veut
that the North Vietnamese wish to commit the U.S.
les États-Unis
more deeply in the war in
en
Indochina.
Indochine.
Would you know what the extent of the U.S. military involvement in Laos is? Do you know what the United States is doing here?
Oui,
Yes,
quand
when
le
need
besoin se fait
arises,
sentir, nous demandons
we
l'aide
ask for
matérielle
material aid.
et nous demandons
We ask
également
also for the
l'intervention
intervention
de l'aviation
of U.S. Air
américaine
Forces
pour surveiller
for
les
surveillance against infiltration
bombarder les
and, if
envahisseurs
necessary,
en cas de
to bomb the invaders.
What do you think would happen to Laos if there was no U.S. air support?
Si nous sommes
If
livrés à
we were
nous-mêmes,
left to ourselves, the whole
tout le
country
pays deviendra
would come
communiste.
communist.
Tout le pays
The
sera
whole
envahi par
country
le
would be
Nord-Vietnam.
invaded by North Vietnam.
Mais c'est le devoir
However,
des
it's the duty of the
États-Unis
United States to
de
protect
nous
us.
protéger.
Are you afraid that Laos could become another Vietnam?
Non,
No.
c'est ce que j'ai toujours
What I've
dit.
always sought
Je cherche
is
à
to prevent
éviter
Laos
que Laos ne devienne
from
un autre
becoming another
Vietnam.
Vietnam.
C'est pourquoi j'ai toujours repoussé
That's why I've always rejected the
la
introduction of foreign troops into Laos.
Your Highness, are you concerned about the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency in Laos?
Je ne peux rien dire à ce
I
sujet.
cannot say anything about this matter.
Whatever may be the ultimate intentions of North Vietnam and Laos, it is clear that they have already succeeded in disturbing the mantle of calm with which President Nixon has wrapped the Vietnam debate in this country. The administration's dilemma arises from the fact that in spite of all that the United States has been able to do for Laos short of ground combat, Hanoi still holds the country at its mercy. North Vietnam can take Laos. It has been able to do so for years, had it been willing to pay the price. However, Hanoi may not be aiming at a military conquest with all its legal and moral implications and with the risk of military overextension. North Vietnam may instead be trying to create the conditions for a political rather than a physical takeover. That's what Pathet Lao Prince Suvarnabhum's invitation to discuss a new coalition government sounds like. Such a solution, if it is a solution, would present the administration with problems only slightly less painful than whether to introduce ground troops to stem the tide in Laos. A communist-dominated government in Laos would cause consternation in Bangkok and Saigon, two places where the American commitment still runs. The North Vietnamese are experts at discovering and exploiting contradictions in American policy. That's what they're doing now in Laos. They see the war there as an extension of their war in Vietnam, and they're forcing us to see it that way too. As long as the war in Vietnam continues, Hanoi can cause us much distress in Laos. It is an opportunity they are not likely to forego. This is Charles Collingwood. Good night.
Laos, America's not-so-secret war in Asia. Reported by Charles Collingwood.